First of all, I want to thank everybody who joined us for our first webinar, which was Process Discovery and Optimization 101. And I want to welcome those of you who are joining us for the first time. My name is Steve Hensel, and I'll be your host today. Today's session is Process Discovery and Prioritization, also known as once you've discovered automatable processes, how do you decide which to do first? So before I introduce or reintroduce our speakers, I want to go over a few housekeeping details. Everyone has been muted. We do welcome and want your questions. So to ask a question, please click on the chat icon in the lower right corner of your screen and type your question. We'll try to get to all your questions during the session. If not, we'll answer them and distribute them afterwards. We will provide you with the recording as well as the slides. In addition, anyone who is attending can receive our process improvement and automation enablement tool that is in an easy-to-use spreadsheet format. I highly encourage you to use it as it can serve as your roadmap to a successful automation effort. I think it's important to provide you with the why and what up front. Why is this important and what will it do for you? The why is automation is increasing rapidly as almost every business undergoes some type of digital transformation effort. Depending upon whom you read, such as Gartner, they're suggesting that 91% of American businesses are undergoing some type of transformation effort. Along those lines, Forrester stated that businesses that are pursuing an automation strategy are seeing an 86% increase in efficiency, a 67% improvement in insights into their customers, and they're able to provide a 57% improved customer experience. Unfortunately, 50% of the automation deployments fail to scale, according to a report by Deloitte. The what, as in what will this do for my organization, is compelling. We're providing you with access to lessons learned and knowledge gained, as well as the experiences from hundreds of assessments and automation projects. So in short, we want you to maximize the benefits without running into the roadblocks that can cause automation efforts to sizzle. As I mentioned, this is a 5-part series. We will build upon today's session and the next session on April 8th, when we'll help you build a business case that gets approved and show you how to track your successes. Our speakers today are Roan Kilgo, CIO, Advantage Point Solutions, and Doug Erb, CEO, Landshore LLC. Roan and Advantage Point have helped over 600 customers find tens, if not hundreds of millions in improvement opportunities. Doug, in turn, brings the perspective of a CEO who has built a small business from the ground up and is now focused on making these technologies and approaches available for companies of all sizes by reducing the time and effort of getting these projects up and running quickly. Hope you enjoyed today's session, and we look forward to your feedback and questions. Roan, I'll let you kick it off.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks all. Couple things just to put this in context. As you see, I put up the prototypical DMAIC methodology, the DMAIC cycle, and I categorize opportunity prioritization in that measure stage of a DMAIC cycle. Doug, often when he approaches this, because he's done a lot of software development, led a lot of software development initiatives in his career, might look at it with an SDLC, software development lifecycle lens. But in general, we're telling you how to choose what you do first, but in what context you make those choices. We're going to give you some tools to be able to understand why things are needing automated right now, when you've already invested in a lot of stuff within your IT stack, and then how to unleash that value by setting the right stage and cadence right up front. So further reminder, in the previous webinar, which is the define stage, that's when you do the ideation. And in the last webinar, I said, first thing you need to do is just make a list. It is that straightforward. Make a list of the things that you want to improve within your environment. Now, you don't have to just use automation to improve things within your environment, but when you start using automation, you'll want to classify those things in your list. And the classification is fairly straightforward: algorithmic or heuristic, meaning rule driven or requires some type of unique human discretion. And then if it's algorithmic, can I get at the rules or can I document the rules quickly? If all the rules are embedded in somebody's brain, sometimes that's harder to get at than if it's a table of rules or a job aid or a standard of procedure. And then start giving some weight as to what impact that will have on how much work a worker is doing, because that's often where most of the cost is. But that's not the only factor. Cost is not the only factor in the quantification. We'll talk about that some down the road. Now, as a reminder, Doug and I talked about this a little bit last time, but everything on that right-hand side is a great candidate for automation. Really, almost anything is a good candidate for automation if it doesn't fall on the left side. So that left side, that heuristic stuff, which can be automated and often is, there's some great technologies, but those projects are generally longer in scope, require a little bit more discipline regarding skill sets and regarding roles within those types of projects. So if it requires conversing with another human being, interpreting an image, you're looking at a picture or you're looking at a fax, interpreting freeform text like you might get from an email from a customer, or doing some type of trial and error problem solving, we generally try to stay away from those use cases with the initial automation efforts. We're looking for those things where we can do matching for the worker, do
So
math. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
yeah, Rowan, and I want to call out this particular slide because a lot of what we see, and I like how we have heuristic versus algorithmic, right? So when you're doing process ranking or process determination of what you're going to automate first, which is what we're looking at here, you really have to think about what you said, which is on the heuristic side, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday. On the heuristic side, you have like interpretation of an image, which we know machine learning can do. And for a lot of you who are looking to, let's say, um, learning of invoicing based on bank reconciliation or banking invoices, that's where you would use something that's a heuristic machine learning versus also using RPA or process automation because you can do endpoint understanding of where the data is laying, right? So in one case, you're really using a process, but when you start getting things that it needs to learn because you're getting different types of invoices and you don't have to update all the time, then you're moving into a heuristic. So can you talk about it? I know you're going to, but I want to make sure we definitely hit on how do you distinguish these two from being a process automation candidate?
Well, with the heuristics, and you did hit on optical character recognition and some of the areas around that type of technology. There are some great automation tools for those tasks, and we've used them many times. Generally, when we're talking about this type of a project, the companies maybe have a platform that's on fire. They really need to drive short-term value. But depending on the RPA technology or the desktop automation technology, if you have some of those optical character recognition facilities with the ability to do some machine learning, you can do those fairly rapidly. But often you diverge into the arcane area. Now, with an automation effort, what you see in the flow, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. What you see in the flow is what I would call a standard 5-step process. Almost everything in a back office or a large operations center is you get your work, you get additional information, you make a decision, you execute the decision, you document the decision. That's the typical 5-step process. When you start interpreting an image or interpreting freeform text, often that's in that middle stage. There's some things that we can quickly carve off from the human having to do in that automation phase, but the variability is extremely high. So I generally try to encourage people to use things in these areas that are out of the box with the RPA technology, but make sure you're planning for that additional effort to bring more and more things into that standard automated flow. So,
Yeah, and I like what you're saying here, Ron. For everybody on the line, what we run into is a lot of people, have in their head, I want to be able to do this type. And an example of the use case I was giving, right? I want to be able to read these invoices, and I want to be able to take that away from having someone have to interpret them every time a new one comes in and it's a different format. It's really, if you're in the middle or have already started your process automation journey and you're on your way, attacking that kind of use case isn't difficult. But if you're reevaluating, like most of the people probably are here, or if you're in the beginning of your journey, attacking that use case is something that you should do with you when you've got a little bit more of a maturity level organizationally.
it's that's a critical point. If the organization can't even conceive of how the computer can start offloading the work and can start providing some of that, figuratively speaking, over the shoulder quality assurance, it's hard for them to then connect the other dots. So we often talk about a scaffolded approach in bringing an organization up to the proper maturity level. And a scaffolded approach is I do, we do, you do. In other words, Landshore or APS would come in and do the first project with you watching. The next one, we would share the resources, share the project plan. The third one is we provide some oversight, some escalation or assistance, but you can do it. Now, if we're doing that, maybe we do that in the initial phase and bring you up to speed on some of your initial automation efforts, which will have high value. As Steve mentioned, some of the reports on this before, it's very significant. Then we can start bringing other technologies in that may require a little bit higher level of skill set to provide the additional value. And it's kind of goes back to something I've been playing with, and that's the automation layering technique. So get your foundation set. Make sure you've got the big stuff in there first, and then start layering on the additional technologies and the additional intelligence, machine learning and artificial intelligence within that framework. And it's going to be a lot more seamless. Now, Steve did mention that one of the Deloitte reports has said half of all automation efforts fail. They generally don't fail in their initial inception. They fail as the company tries to start scaling it, pushing it out to more groups, getting broader use from it. And one of the main reasons that we've seen that these fail is because the proper framing of the initial opportunities was not done. Like I was thinking this morning, back in my Boy Scout days, I got the ecology merit badge. It'd probably be called environmentalism merit badge now. But one of the things that was said over and over and over was think globally, act locally, right? So I can do something here locally, but I have to understand that what I'm doing here locally with this automation stuff is sustainable when it starts going across the organization. So when you're doing the framing of the automation opportunities, you need to think about those enterprise systems that you have in place and how those systems and some of those processes inherent in those systems drive commonality of activity across the departments. A reconciliation might be a good one if you're a bank, and we're going to give you basically two different vertical market examples today. We're going to be talking about banking a little bit. We're going to be talking about health insurance claims. But if you're doing banking, everything in the organization has to track back to that general ledger. Well, that then brings a level of commonality that almost every department has to interact with that system. You need to start understanding that and making sure that you're not doing something in this department that's not reusable with that general ledger in another department. Fragmentation is what you're going to be combating often with the automation efforts, and that's just the natural tendency of things to move into their maximum state of disorder unless somebody or something is keeping it together. And so Combating fragmentation is a lot of what we do here. So you're going to hear us articulate some of the value proposition as defragging activities and defragging your staffing model. Does that make sense? So we talked about a prototypical process, and I'm showing you maybe a loan underwriting process in a bank. This is something we've done in many, many banks. And think about it as a 5-step process. I accept the loan application, which is getting work. Maybe that comes from a branch. Maybe it comes from a website. Once I've had that loan package accepted, I'm going to have to gather additional information, whether it's credit reports, appraisals on a property, if it's a property loan, things of that nature. Then it hits maybe an underwriter's desk. If the underwriter believes they have all the information they need, they can make a decision to approve or deny. If they don't have all the information they believe they need, they'll send it back. They'll request additional information. Fairly straightforward process on its face. Where the fragmentation happens, and the first type of fragmentation I talk about is what I call vertical fragmentation. Based on the channel that the business comes in, you create a new swim lane. Now, each of those swim lanes is doing exactly the same process. The variability is in how the applications come in. Maybe I have to gather slightly different information, or I'm using a different standard to judge certain things in the application. And then my output may also go to different places, to different consumers. That vertical fragmentation is a natural consequence of trying to accommodate a business that has variability. But the variability is in the inputs and the outputs, not in the actual process itself.
So Roan,
yeah, go ahead.
And I think you're getting to this here, but you know, I look at these types of these types of presentations, especially what you're talking about, which is there's all kinds of fragmentation of applications. There's stuff everywhere. A lot of times we talk to customers and we hear that, why don't I just burn it down, right? If it's
Yeah.
such a problem, why don't I just burn it down, centralize my applications and have a big, effectively what a big implementation would be. You look at people who are implementing things like Workday or who are implementing large ERP systems. They effectively said, hey, I'm just going to burn this thing down. Why wouldn't someone burn it down and implement a universal system versus, just keep what they have in place and just, do a whole process ranking and process automation?
It's a great question, and we see this often. In fact, automation specialists like APS often are called in after somebody has burned it down and put in a new system, but they failed to understand all the interconnectedness of the old stuff that they built. The new system doesn't quite have either the interconnectedness, or there's some purpose-built things that were done under the old way of doing business that's gone. And so now we're filling gaps that the new system has. Now, and it's not anybody's fault. You say, well, that's just poor planning. What most people, when they're looking at this type of activity, whether they're buying a new system or trying to extend an old system, they fail to understand the true working environment. And this is where some of the analytics that we can help people with comes into play. I mentioned before a property casualty insurance company, just one of their contact centers, 2,500 people doing back office and contact center work. Nobody in the center thought that they used more than 18 or 20 applications across the center, but the enterprise architect did a study basically and showed that they were using 503 different applications in that center alone. So when you talk about burning down something that has gotten fragmented and crufty, that may be the only way you can gain control of certain central aspects. And if you can address your issues with some type of forklift upgrade, I think that's fantastic. But more often than not, even when you do that, there's gaps, there's undefined operational impacts that you often need to come in with a lightweight automation tool and fill pretty quickly to keep the business on track and to give you the true value that you bought when you did that enterprise ERP or
Right.
enterprise CRM upgrade.
It's funny how when we go through those larger implementations of software, how you always have one or two lingering legacy systems because it just does what it does, you know?
Right. And it's too risky often for certain areas of the business to decommission that without seeing something in place. And I mean, since the 1990s, I've been hearing about how mainframes are going away. And mainframe operations are in just about every one of these large businesses that we do engagements with, because there's something in there that just does what it does, and the company doesn't want to take the risk of moving it to a different technology. Now, the other type of fragmentation that you see is when that straight through process, even if it's in the swim lanes, starts needing to be fragmented, because each of the steps within that 5-step process has some complexity. Once again, usually born of variability. Variability is your enemy in a lot of this stuff. Using the automation technology to homogenize that variability has tremendous impacts. But as you fragment horizontally, you create these handoff events. Each handoff event has a drag. I did a study a few years back that showed, on average, across several hundred customers that we had done this kind of thing with, each handoff created a 5% drag in that particular process. 5% reduction in throughput, 5% increase in time to process whatever the transaction was. Also, each of those steps has a quality component that often has to be assured. Usually that's also a body, a coach, a quality coach, or some type of quality assurance professional. And for any of those stages that have any type of regulatory compliance or governmental oversight, you need to create an audit process that goes in and makes sure that if you are audited, that you got your act together, that you have the proper audit trails. And with the evolving Sarbanes-Oxley standards and the various compliance regulations, especially in banking, but it goes across anybody that uses payment cards and anybody that touches healthcare information. These audit processes have huge impact. I was in a large bank that had just finished paying an $18 billion fine because they couldn't properly demonstrate certain aspects of the way they did their underwriting in their mortgage department. What this means, though, in the long run, and Doug, I know you've seen this in a lot of places, what seems like should be straightforward can quickly become 17 processes, not just one, with many opportunities for failure, for drop in throughput or increase in time, increased friction. And as you look at that across all of your swim lanes, it's not unusual to go into these large banks and see that they have hundreds sometimes of departments that are just doing loan-related activities. That's how the fragmentation begins to represent itself in an organizational structure. In fact, one of the first artifacts when I started an engagement with a company that I asked for, and they often understand why I do this, I say, can I see your org chart? I just want to know how your departments are organized. As you begin to see the hierarchy, you'll see, and this is often common in insurance companies, you'll have a vice president in charge of claim intake. You'll have a vice president in charge of claim processing. You'll have a vice president in charge of claim decisioning, with the groups in each of those, sometimes massive groups. Beginning to defrag that organization, the technology has to support it, the business processes have to support it, and there's a huge element of organizational change management. But you can marshal those forces and have dramatic uplifts just by defragging some of those groups, whether it's vertically defrag, horizontally defrag, anytime you bring those things together and make them more common, you have a positive uplift as a natural consequence. So Doug, you and I were talking about this yesterday, kind of how we get started, because I think it was Steve that was saying his head was hurting after all that. It seems overwhelming to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So this is where I harken back to, you need to think globally, but you need to act locally. Locally here means let's just talk to the team about the process that they do. And I often do this on a whiteboard with a group. What's your process? What kicks off your process? Well, we accept a loan application. What do you do next? Well, we have to get some other information to make a decision on it. And then our underwriter makes the decision. What do you do next? Just put that process down, and then you're pushing upstream and downstream. By the way, this is called a SIPOC, supplier, input, process, output, consumers. So I say, when you're accepting a loan application, what are your inputs? Who do you get them from? Once again, on the whiteboard. When you start getting additional information, where does that additional information come from? Who do you get that from? And you see the variability over here, even though you see some commonality, borrow, broker, the variability keeps increasing and increasing. And then you have variability that may be based on location, different rules based on the state that you're in or the city that you're in. So what you find out pretty quickly is there's a lot of stuff coming in, and those inputs take a lot of different formats. One of the times that you need to think locally is, remember that the human is going to tell you how they get that information, and they get it in a method that's comfortable to them. Almost always that information is available in another format, a format that is better utilized by a machine. You just need to be asking those questions. Often the group that you're doing the SIPOC exercise with doesn't know that that paper app that they get has already been scanned and OCR'd by the scanning department, and that information is digitally available because they're used to looking at the paper. But you need to understand that anything you can utilize that's already in place doing that job of taking analog information to digital information, it's just going to make your job easier in driving the benefit. Any thoughts on this so far, Doug? Is this ring true?
Yeah, and I think when you start looking at the key benefits of this, a lot of our customers, especially if you're trying to do an ROI analysis, right? A lot of our customers will look at, process automation as a method of reducing hours, reducing work hours. But one of the things that I like about this particular example is it shows that a human to human interaction is what most of your customers are looking for. So it's a real opportunity to leverage process automation and rank more appropriately those processes that can create a higher CSAT level and higher revenue numbers through retention of your own customers. And so this is a great example of people who get frustrated. And I know what happens to me when I'm talking to my bank people. I don't want to hear like the 15 options that I have to go through. Eventually, I just want to press 0 and talk to a human. And in talking to that human, what I don't want to have to do also is go through all of the points and questions that I just went through in either a computer to human transfer or human to human transfer. And so when you're thinking about process ranking like we're talking about right now, don't always think about hours reductions. And I love this particular SIPOC that you have here as an example of some things that you should be thinking about when you're ranking these things.
Well, it's a good point. And what happens as you begin to automate more and more of the information that your worker needs to engage with your customers, the profile of who you might even hire for that position will change. So contact centers years ago went through a cycle where the technology started getting more and more complicated that the workers had to use. So the gut reaction was, well, let's start hiring younger people who are more technologically proficient. Well, as they moved to people who are more technologically proficient, what they often found out was they were lousy communicators to other humans. And so rather than improving customer satisfaction, they were decreasing it. And one of the underlying concepts that you point out here, Doug, is the more that you can automate that algorithmic activity, the more you free up whatever human is doing the human to human contact within your company, your banker, your customer service agent, your branch manager, whoever it is, you free them up to do um, the establishing rapport and showing empathy and trial and error problem solving and really understanding the root of the issues and getting this thing done. They're not having to understand how to manipulate 503 different applications to get what they need. You've got the automations feeding them the information that they need to do their job with the customer. So it's a great point. Now, once again, think globally, but act locally. Your local action here is you're going to try to automate as much of this process in place as you can. But when you execute that automation, you have to be aware that there's upstream and downstream impacts and synergies. There's things that you can take into consideration with how you get information from upstream and where the information goes to really accelerate and expand the benefit you get from this. Often, and I think Steve can address this, often vendors of the automation technologies will tell people, and they're accurate in this statement, we can automate that process in place. We don't have to change the process, we can automate it in place, meaning we'll do what your humans are doing. But there's no reason when you're automating that process in place that if the information is available in 2 or 3 different formats, that even though the human does it one way, paper format, you should be getting a digital format in. So those are some of the nuances you need to think about that will accelerate your automation effort. But then once you figure out that that information is already digitally available in your organization, others can benefit from that same finding and those same automations.
I agree with you, Ron, and that's one of the things I've seen through several of these implementations is when done correctly, the people doing the work actually enjoy it more because they're able to do their job with less focus on technology because the information is being provided to them. And think about it, none of us go to work to do spreadsheets and cut and paste into different systems. We were hired to help be creative and make decisions. So when you hear people talk about take the robot out of the human, that's really what a good automation project should do.
Well, that's exactly right. And it's in my view, you're putting the human back in charge. Once you automate some of these things, the human is now not just that technology bridge. They're not that proverbial Dutch boy trying to plug all the holes and wrap things together. You put them back in charge of the activity. They can then focus on the higher value stuff because they're not having to do the math and the matching and the go through the tedious rules. So this, rather than denigrating the human activity, this actually elevates it. Now, another aspect of it is you can usually do the same volume of work with fewer people. Uh, and sometimes groups get threatened by that, but I always ask this question when somebody's worried about it. I say, look, if we're projecting here for this group, for this activity alone, maybe you need 20% fewer people. What was your attrition in this group last year? And usually it's something double that. It's double whatever benefit we're going to give them. And I say, so you're just going to have fewer training classes in the coming year, and your employee satisfaction is going to go up because this tedious work is going to be removed from their desk. So it's a win-win. And very rarely have I run into employees who are getting one of these robotic assistants that we're talking about who then want it to just go away. In fact, I was at a place and we had done some work for a group, and because of some of the technology decisions underlying it, there were a few bugs that this one group experienced. And they called me and they said, go talk to this guy over here. He can, he really hates what you did, and he can give you all the ins and outs. So I went over there and I said, so show me what's going on. And he showed me 2 or 3 things that I knew we could address. But I said, look, I'm looking at the chart here, and you're not even supposed to be in this group. You are a volunteer to start using this automation. I tell you what, to relieve your pain, I'm just going to go to your supervisor and have you removed from the group. And he said, no, you can't take this away from me. I said, well, that's interesting. Everybody here thinks you hate it. She says, no, this is the greatest thing ever. I just want it to work right. Just do these few tweaks and this is going to be awesome. So you have to understand, people are looking for these robotic assistants, these little aids in there, so that they can focus on that customer. Now, within, and we're going to shift to a medical example, and this is a real life project that I did for somebody that was billing and collecting money from insurance companies on behalf of a couple of different doctors groups. And we went in and looked at their activity from the time a claim hit their desk, to hit their facility, to the time that it was totally finished. It was an average of 59 days. Now, average of 59 days, and as many of you who work in this arena know, many states have prompt pay penalties kicking in after just 10 days, some after 30. 59 days is large. And that means if I have a bunch of them in at 10 days, I have a whole nother load that may be 180 days before we get that claim properly paid or properly resolved. Within each of these departments, and these 9 blocks represent distinct departments with their own processes, their own leadership, their own workers. You see the prototypical 5-step process. For them, we translated the get work as pull information. The get more information as massage the information. Often the information was there, but you needed some external references added to it before it could go into a database. Then they would do their job, the comparison or the determination. Then they had to make it happen and then let everybody know that it happened. So you could paint that 5-step process into each one of these groups. Once again, they're all doing medical claims. All doing medical claims for the same doctor's units. But the activity flow falls. Then what we said was, there's high value here. There's many things that we can do straight through processing in this accounts receivable group. And within the collections group, especially with the periodic follow-ups, there's a lot of stuff we can do there. So this is where we're acting locally. We're going to take and drive maximum improvement for these 2 groups. But as we execute those, we let the team know, when we do this for accounts receivable and collections, certain things are going to happen within those groups that are going to allow us to expand the benefit of at least a portion of that automation. For example, every one of those groups had a flavor of reconciliation that they had to do. Once we create a reconciliation bot for payment and collections, even though 2 or 3 of the applications that we're using for the data to reconcile may not be common, the core were common, and it's the same clients, it's the same book of claims being done. So we could create bots that could then be reused across all of the operations. The same with the report generation activity. Now, as you do this, you could drive benefit with this group, payment posting, drive benefit with the collections group. They see the benefit. They'll also start the buzz on the floor, but they're beginning to teach people, even if it's just hallway chatter, about how their job is being made easier, friction is being reduced, how these things are helping them. And as you introduce some of the things that have high reuse potential across the other groups, you can get that synergy going. Now, each of the groups may have their own unique point automations, point solutions that you can execute that continues to add that value. And you should do that. But execute one, execute another, and then find the commonality. Now, when I say find the commonality, tactically, here's what you're going to do. When you do the automation, make sure that any of the business rules, which are the most variable parts of many of these processes, have been externalized in some fashion. Don't allow the developer to do what developers often do because they're not told any different, and that's build the rules into the base automation code. Externalize your variables so that you can then reuse the base code for other areas, and you're going to accelerate and expand how you drive success and benefit through the group. Here's the other thing. I remember a bank I was in where there was a large consultancy that was bragging about 930 bots that they created for somebody. And I had the temerity to ask the CIO if he was happy about having 935 separate pieces of code that he's now having to support. And needless to say, no, he wasn't. Those 930 bots basically did this, a reconciliation. And you can maintain a central reconciliation bot. And then when those variable things happen with maybe your Visa report or your MasterCard report coming in slightly different, you're only tweaking an external object. You're not tweaking the automation itself. That's going to give longer life to the automation. It's going to make it more extensible, but you have to think globally. You have to externalize those variables so that when you go to the next department, you have that core automation that you can use out of the box, and you're just attaching something new to the front end or defining a new output at the back end.
Yeah, so Ron, and not to over discuss this, but one of the things that we see a lot is people using coordinate-based screen scraping rather than actually intelligent-based screen grabbing,
Yeah,
and all that does
brittle.
is yeah, it breaks the minute anyone makes a modification to the screen, especially if it's a web application, and that happens all the time, right?
Sure.
So those are little tricks of the coding trade around rolling these things out. We'll probably discuss further down the line.
Yeah, I mean, so within, and that's a great point because within that operating system, you could interact with that surface stuff, which back in the old days they called screen scraping, okay? Or you can go another level down within the operating system and interact with the actual objects. When you start interacting with the objects, even if they change location or the labels change, any number of things, the automation is far more resilient. So that's a great point, and it's one of those things that you need to think about. Act locally, think globally. You need to just keep those background considerations in mind as you progress through this. So, Doug, that's really the last content slide that we have for this. And we'll share the spreadsheet. It's actually a workbook with some of these tools that we use. A few things within this chart that I want to mention. We talked about the 59-day average. Some of the stuff included in one of these departments, a 75-day backlog. When you start automating opportunities, once we did an automation and we were able to attach it to that backlog, we simply added 4 or 5 clones, let's say 4 or 5 servers to process that book of business. And within about 2 weeks, we had the 75-day backlog whittled down to 1 day. Now, those servers, because of the way the underlying technology works, can be reutilized, and that server capacity can be used for other automations. But it's a way you can go in there and do the equivalent of adding a whole bunch of bodies who are already trained to do the process because the automation is created, but add a whole bunch of the digital workers, that digital workforce, to a process and get through a backlog so that you can begin to get that 59 days down to less than 30 days in this example. And don't underestimate going from 59 days to, let's say, 29 days. When you do that, what you've done for that company is you've moved an entire month of collections or revenue into the current fiscal year. So just that alone, regardless of what you've done with your cost structure, you've enhanced at least for that year by an entire month or 1/12 of their revenue generation. So reducing that cycle time with this type of activity has one of the greatest impacts on the business and often funds more than enough software and staff to be able to get at many more of these opportunities. The other thing that you want to take into consideration, and this is often just a gut feel from your developer, is as you start defining this and you're showing the developer what you're going to be automating, they need to be able to say that's going to be very highly complex, medium complex, or low complexity. You need to factor that into it, because if you have two things that are equal in value, but your developer says this has high complexity or high risk, this has low complexity or low risk, yes, you're going to go with the low risk one because you're wanting to get as much benefit as fast as possible for the operational structure of the organization. Doug, any closing thoughts for us?
No, I think you're spot on with some of the development pieces specifically that you brought out. But no, I think we're good.
Great. So, Steve, are there any questions?
Yeah, the one question that had come in after the last one really had to do with the opportunity identification worksheet. And I think we were able to answer the question, but I'll let you speak a little bit more to it, that
okay.
It is a spreadsheet with 5 tabs, and each tab represents one of the webinars. So we're going to cover one of those activities, such as the one upcoming webinar on April 8th. We'll talk about building the business case and ROI so that you can support your automation efforts. Do you want to speak any more to how you came up with that spreadsheet and what all it entails?
Well, when you think about the life cycle of a process improvement effort, and this is not about process definition, this is about process improvement. You have to go through the analysis and you have to kind of develop tools to be able to get you to the point where you can satisfy all of the stakeholders. One of the stakeholders that's almost always here, especially with large projects, is going to be the CFO community, right? You're going to have to quantify things for a CFO in dollars and cents, and also tell him where on his balance sheet, if anywhere, he's going to actually see those dollars and cents. But for the operational people, you need to tell them maybe after we do this, the stuff that's going to be left over is going to be harder. So the time, your average time to do this task is going to go up, but you're going to only be doing half as many of them. So if your time is going to increase by 10% per transaction, but you're doing 50% fewer, that's a net benefit to the organization. But you have to coach them on where they're going to see the value and the impact within their operational areas. So each of the sheets, and there may end up being more than 5, are just a way that you can progress through the thought process, get your baselines defined, then start defining what you want to do to improve on those baselines, what methodology you want to use to drive that improvement. And if you use that methodology and you're able to even get a portion of the improvement, what impact financially and operationally is it going to have in your organization? So we give you little tools that kind of take you along that journey that you can use as a starting point. It's not a locked sheet, so you can edit it and use it just about any way you want, but it gives you all the major blocks that you need to consider. And usually when if I'm doing a business case for a company, or if the company's doing the business case on their own, each one of those spreadsheets is used in the value proposition and in the discussion around, we want to do this project, and if we do it, this is the results we expect. The other thing that happens with that sheet is it then becomes our scorecard. As we do the project, we want to track, are we meeting what we said we were going to meet? And if not, why not? Often for some categories, we'll overperform. It may be a couple of other categories that had some change events that change some of the baselines. We might underperform. The goal here, though, is to get to the project end state, whatever that iteration end state is, and meeting or exceeding the expectations. And this helps you stay focused on why you're doing this and what you expect out of the effort. So we'll be augmenting that workbook with each of these webinars with additional tools and devices.
I appreciate that, Roan, and I certainly hope that everyone who attended gained some insight and ideas from what we shared today. I also hope you enjoyed the interaction between Roan and Doug. And along those lines, we know that the best source of ideas and suggestions come from customers and attendees like you. And along those lines, and obviously we do want to hear from you, but in upcoming webinars, you're going to start hearing from businesses and people who have gone through or are going through these exact steps that we're talking about, and learn things such as how do you deal with blockers when somebody just doesn't want you to move forward. So our recommendations: use the process improvement and automation enhancement tool. Join us for the next webinar on building your business case on April 8th. And certainly, most importantly, follow Doug on LinkedIn so that you can learn about his Lego journey and actually what his dog thinks about his Lego designs. In all seriousness, thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.